All right, really quickly, I'm gonna run through this, and then if you have any questions, please ask. So the very first thing you should have done was distributed the -5 to both of these things. When you did that, this became negative 15m minus 50. Then you could have combined the terms. These two are the same, so do exactly what it says. 4 minus 15 to get negative 11. Make sure you're keeping the variables. When you lose the variables, you kind of mess up things. And then from here, get rid of the 50 by adding it to both sides. And then the very last step would be to get m by itself by dividing both sides by negative 11. So if you got negative 16, that was the correct answer. Give yourself a round of applause, pat on the back, whatever. Did we have any questions about that? There was one problem that we didn't finish last class, I think number 6. Yeah. We did 6 one way, we didn't do it the second way. I said we're gonna do that. So we're gonna do that, and then we're gonna jump into some other notes, which is related to this. It's just more of it after lunch. At 41, you guys can get your phones though. So I'm gonna do 6 again. If you like the way we did it last class, you want me to write this down. If you want to write this down, we're welcome to do so. Just make sure your phone is put back. The other way you might want to do this is dealing with the fractions. I know some of you are like, why would we do that? But sometimes you just have to, or you might forget about the first way, and this may be the only thing that sticks, whatever. So instead of multiplying everything, I'm still going to be multiplying, but not like I did last. I want to combine these two fractions. And the only way to do that is if they both have the same denominator. So I'm going to think of something these both go into, which still happens to be that same number we talked about, 6. And instead of multiplying everything, I just want to figure out how could I change this to 6. So if I multiply this by 2, that would become 6. But with fractions, what I do to one piece of it, I have to do to the other. So I'm also going to multiply this numerator piece by 2. And then for the other piece of the fraction, I want to make this denominator 6, so I'm going to multiply this by 3. And just like I did here, what I do to one piece, I have to do to the other. So I'm also multiplying that by 3. So both fractions are going to change, and it'll look like this. So now with both fractions changed and we have the same denominator, I can combine this into one big fraction. I could rewrite it as just 6x plus 3x all over 6 equals 7 instead of the separated. Then it's going to kind of flow similarly to what we did last class. I could combine, I don't know why I put 6, that was supposed to be 4, sorry. There we go. I could combine my numerators together. We're still dealing with the fraction. And I want to say, in this class we did number 3. Is that right? Did we do number 3 last class? Yes, okay. So what we talked about with the fraction, you have two choices. You could multiply by 6 and then divide by 7 separately, or take the whole fraction, flip it. and multiply that on both sides. And then I could put this in my calculator, but because this 7 is really all your whole numbers are over 1, so these 7s are going to cancel. And this is just going to leave us with 6 over 1, which is the original answer we got. This is just a different way to go about it. What questions do we have on that? So these notes should be on the test. Oh, that's the new set. It's that one. Yep. Okay. Were there any other questions we wanted to go through before we jump to our new set of notes? Really just on this page. Right, so we're gonna move on to the next part. Figure out which page this is. That's the nitrogen one. That should be the answer. That. It's also high order. I don't know what's up. I'm gonna close this and reopen it and see if that works. But you should be looking at the one that kind of looks like a cell phone, the notes that kind of look like a cell phone.